Dai, 30 secondi.
We can start in 30 seconds.
Così la mandiamo. Eccoci qua.
Siamo.
Ready to go?
Pure, fatti vedere.
Dai, 30 secondi.
We can start in 30 seconds.
Così la mandiamo. Eccoci qua.
Siamo.
Ready to go?
Pure, fatti vedere.
Dai, 30 secondi.
We can start in 30 seconds.
Così la mandiamo.
And we'd like to...
Eccoci qua.
Are we ready? Yeah. Yes, we are. So, welcome everybody to King's, and welcome to the people connected on YouTube as well. The Italian Society of King's is delighted to have this event tonight with two such distinguished professor of economics. And for the people on YouTube, we apologize because you will not be able to see the slides, which are up here, and you will not be able to see them. So this is the second event we do in this series called How to Reverse the Course of Italy's Decline. We started in November with Professor Capussela, Professor Radelli, and Professor Tonani to discuss the historical roots of the Italian current economic stagnation. And tonight we'll continue this debate with Professor Lorenzo Codogna, who's visiting professor at the European Institute at the London School of Economics, and is the CEO of his consulting firm, Lorenzo Codogna Macro Advisors, right? Yeah. And then we have Professor Michele Boldrini from the University of Washington, St. Louis, and from the University of Foscari in Venice. So without further ado, I would like to thank my friend Oreste Gallo, who does a lot in the organization of this event. And without further ado, I will leave the floor to Professor Codogna for his presentation. And thank you everyone for coming on a Friday night in London. It's very appreciated to see so many of you tonight here. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, very good. So thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you. It's a great honor for me, a pleasure to be here, particularly with Michele Boldrini, I would say, but also for all of you. And I made a big effort of crossing the street today, so
I crossed the channel.
Okay, yeah, exactly. As a way of disclaimer, I would say, I have to say that I haven't been in Italy over the past month, okay? That's just to make on the safe side. And, you know, my surname, coincidentally, happens to be the center of the outbreak of the coronavirus in Italy, okay? I have no connection, luckily enough, family or friends connection there. But I have to say that I'm also, I grew up in Padua, which is the other outbreak, so I'm fully covered, okay? So,
And I was having dinner yesterday night, very near Bologna.
okay, so stay away from
Wonderful
me.
lesson. Well, relatively near.
Okay, so when I was first invited here, I thought that that is about structural issues, okay? And so I kind of started to think about, you know, how to deal with this topic. And the title is How to Reverse the Course of Italy's Decline. But as a matter of fact, before reversing the course of Italy's decline, we have to prevent another downturn, which is related to the shock. Okay, so the presentation today, more than on structural issues, is really how to deal with shocks. And it's not just an Italian problem; it's a European Eurozone problem, so to say. And so I'll kind of dig a little bit on that. So I have some slides. Let me start with the current global situation. So where do we stand here? First of all, as you know, there's been another shock, which is a trade war shock, which has already affected the global economy, and there has been a significant slowdown in activity throughout the globe. You know, a big chunk was due to trade wars, in my view. It's probably due to many other reasons. And you see here a leading indicator, which is the global manufacturing PMI, which declined for quite a while and was basically ready to recover. and you see the red line, which I was already pointing at. Actually, we saw also some tentative signs of recovery in industrial production. So everything else being equal, and without this kind of new shock due to the coronavirus, probably the global economy was about to rebound. Not restart a new expansion, but probably about to rebound. However, there were also some worrying signs here, which is a little bit, tricky, this graph. But you see there the red line, which shows the Baltic Dry Index, which is the cost of hiring ships, and it's basically a proxy for global trade. If you ratio, it's a leading indicator for global trade. As you can see, before the outbreak of the coronavirus was already declining sharply. Now, where Europe stands in all this, you see that Germany was affected the most and was declining quite sharply, but there was also a little bit of a rebound. Italy, which is less exposed to manufacturing and global trade than Germany, was rebounding with a small lag, but was about to rebound as well. If we look at some indicators, this is the produced by Citi. I get it through data stream, but this is what is called surprise index. So basically, it compares the forecast of economists with the actual data that come out. It's a daily series, and you see that again, same message. So the economy was about to rebound, and you see the red area in positive territory. And suddenly, there's been a change, and now it's going deeply into negative, meaning that economic indicators are coming out much weaker than expectations by economists. Now, why the economy, the global economy is weak, and the Eurozone economy is weaker, in my view? First of all, there are a number of factors. The financial assets, the asset valuations is overstretched almost everywhere, in my view. There are many financial issues related to credit growth in some places, like China, which, by the way, they introduced additional monetary stimulus now. They might even amplify the potential risks there. And there are many areas in financial markets which are weak and vulnerable. I don't want to get into the details. But indeed, the situation, the global situation to me is fragile. The Eurozone situation is even more fragile. And let me go a little bit in details before moving to Italy. You see here that since the 2008-2009 crisis and then the sovereign debt crisis, debt to GDP has increased almost everywhere. And with the exception of very few countries, they have remained quite high, meaning that there is not much leeway for fiscal policy in case of need, almost everywhere, with the exception of Germany. In the Eurozone, there is what is called the risk of multiple equilibria. So when you have a shock, financial markets might react in ways that kind of polarize the two groups of countries within the Eurozone. Now, multiple equilibria is something you cannot observe, okay? It's not that you go out and you see multiple equilibria. So there are indirect ways to look into that. My proposal here, my way to look into this is to look at the spread versus the ratings. And you see that there is a little bit of a gap between core countries and peripheral countries. I have to say that I've done this graph for many months, and looking back a few months ago, the situation was much worse. So now there is not much, but again, it could happen again. So you can have a big divergence between core and periphery in the Eurozone, which would basically make the situation more difficult for peripheral countries, make it difficult to rebound. Then there is another big issue, big problem, a so-called doom loop. So the relationship between sovereign debt and the banks in the Eurozone as you know, it's a two-way relationship. In other words, when you have the sovereign get into severe pressure because of markets, financial markets, then you have the banks suffering. Why is that? Because the banks have very big portfolios of government bonds. You see from this graph, this is taken from the ECB. These are not portfolios of country-specific portfolio. In other words, the red line is the line that depicts Italy, and these are the percentage of government bonds as a percentage of total assets. But unfortunately, it doesn't take only into account Italian government bonds, but also overall Eurozone government bonds. Having said that, 85% is Italian government bond, or even slightly higher. And this is true for most countries in the Eurozone. And you see here that Italy is on top of the list here, second only to Portugal. Portugal had some specific issues with the banking sector, so I won't go through it, but effectively, Italy has the largest share of government bonds in the portfolio of banks. And if you take the stock, given that the stock of debt is very high in Italy, it's even bigger, okay, the situation here. So what happens? So again, there is a two-way relationship. So the banks can also enter into run into problems. So we saw that in other countries, in Spain, in Ireland, during the crisis. And once the banks go into problems, given that they strive in Europe, but when they die, they have to call for the government, and they push for they produce also problems for the sovereign in which they are based. So this problem is very much alive, and it is particularly severe in Italy. Let me go through this graph for you. I mean, it was astonishing to see how strong this relationship still is today. As you remember, last year in May, a new government took office in Italy. It was a populist government, okay, formed by kind of extreme right and should I say extreme left? I say it's something that nobody knows what they stand for, but you know, it's a kind of they put together two strange parties that never they were not in power before. So market took that very badly initially. The spread widened, as you can see, the red line, it's the spread. Almost immediately, the banks cut on lending. The black line is the lending to non-financial corporations and households. Why is that? Because even though some banks can put the holdings of government bonds into a kind of held-to-maturity portfolio, financial markets look through the balance sheet, look through the accounts and say, okay, you have a big government bond portfolio, you have losses in your government portfolio, you need more capital, effectively. So what do you do if you need more capital? You cannot sell the bond, you cannot recapitalize yourself because you don't have much access to financial markets. What do? You cut on lending. And that happens quite sharply. The strange thing is that it hasn't yet recovered. And you see that despite the spread, at some point it started to go down, it's back to normal, we'll say. Now, the lending continue to shrink. Why is that? It's difficult to understand. If you talk to the banks, they say, well, there's no demand. The investment activity has declined immediately to such an extent that there is no longer demand for loans, okay? I think there is also a supply side story. So again, it's also the banks that are not willing to extend credit to the economy. I think they have been hit because of the widening spread last year. They are now reluctant. The appetite for risk is pretty low. As a matter of fact, credit is not flowing to the economy. Now, Italy has many problems. Okay, probably we will discuss that later on, but and structural issues. But certainly on top of that, there is also a problem of credit flow. Credit is not flowing through the economy. What that means? It means that monetary policy, despite being very accommodative, is not flowing. It's not the traditional banking channel of monetary policy is not working in the case of Italy. Is it just the case of Italy, or is it the Eurozone? Look at this graph here. And you see that credit to non-financial corporations, okay, are behaving in a completely different fashion in the Eurozone. In Italy, there is still a contraction, substantial contraction, and actually it's not slowing. It actually looks like it is accelerating. And in other countries, Germany, France, situation is increasingly improving. Eurozone, given that it is affected by many other peripheral countries, Spain, Greece, etc., is still struggling. Okay? So there is some recovery in overall credit, but not much. So you have basically core Europe on the one hand and periphery on the other, effectively, which is very bizarre. If you have a situation like this, I think the problem is that effective monetary policy is not single. It's not a single policy in the Eurozone, so it's still a big issue. Moving forward, so if you have a shock, you have these situations which makes the Eurozone fragile, and then you have very little policy tools that can be activated. We already said that debt to GDP is still pretty high across Europe, and so there's not much policy space on the fiscal side. On the monetary side, as you know, central banks, all central banks, more or less, are constrained by the so-called zero lower bound or soft zero lower bound, because effectively zero lower bound is not really zero. It's somewhat below zero, but still you cannot cut. You can still do something, and I'm sure that the ECB would do something should the situation indeed deteriorate. But there's not much leeway, meaning that indeed monetary policy is constrained, and if you don't have monetary policy, inevitably you have to rely on fiscal policy. But again, a number of reasons prevent the Eurozone from activating fiscal policy in a substantial way, not least the fiscal rules, but it's not just the fiscal rules. I think politically, in some countries, it's a bit toxic, I would say, to talk about the fiscal expansion. And to be quite honest, I mean, if you have a country which has a debt to GDP in excess of 130%, it becomes difficult to finance your debt if you go for a substantial fiscal expansion. Effectively, the country doesn't have fiscal space. Here, just to show the ECB that has no space at all, the problem is not just related to short-term interest rates. It's also related to long-term interest rates, because, as you know, there's a big chunk of long-term government bonds in the Eurozone that are in negative territory in terms of yields. And so basically the whole term structure of interest rate is flat. There are estimates about the so-called term premium, and it is in negative territory. So the whole structure of interest rates from short to long is pretty low, if not negative. In some countries, still positive. And it's not just a situation in the Eurozone or the ECB. If we look at in the US, despite the Fed having some leeway to cut the interest rates, the whole structure of interest rate is already flat, is already, so basically any additional fiscal monetary stimulus would have little effect, not much effect on the economy. So again, monetary a little bit constrained. Fiscal, as you can see here, there is not much fiscal stimulus in the pipeline. These are numbers coming from the Commission. The Commission has, I would say, inside information on European budget, the public finance situation in Europe, because they have a continuous dialogue with governments, so they know exactly how the situation is. These numbers are structural primary balances, and as you probably know, the changes in the structural balance is what depicts, what defines the fiscal stance. Okay, so if we are in negative territory, it means that fiscal policy is expansionary. If you are in positive territory, it is restrictive. Okay, it means that it's tightening. Oddly enough, if you remember the first graph when I show the PMIs, the decline in the manufacturing PMI started in Germany at the end of 2017. But oddly enough, Germany tightened fiscal policy in 2018, which is completely counterintuitive. Now, we can, try to kind of understand why it was that, and I have a few explanations, but I won't go into that. The point that is interesting here is that even on European Commission forecast, you see that there isn't much easing in the pipeline. Okay, these are forecasts by the Commission, so 19 and 20. 19 is still a forecast, and 20 is definitely a forecast, and you see that there is not much easing in fiscal policy. And so you might expect that with an external shock, which might be exogenous, partly asymmetric, so far as affected Italy, but it could affect also other countries, you might expect that this situation changes, but I can tell you that there is no sign that this is going to happen, at least in the near term. So back to the fiscal situation, this again is the output gap, which is the red line and the dotted red lines, and you see that at some point the situation is stabilized, so basically the Eurozone has not continued to expand, but also the other line, which is again structural balances, and you see that not only there is no, the stance of fiscal policy is not expansionary, but the European Commission, which again has the best possible forecast that we can imagine because they have all the numbers, they have a continuous dialogue with the governments, have consistently made a mistake in assessing the fiscal stance. And so if you see the dotted lines, which is the kind of vintage of forecast, they have consistently pointed to some easing in policy, which never materialized. Okay. This is a recent paper that I wrote, actually the third version of a paper that I wrote with a Dutch guy, and it is about fiscal capacity and safe bond. It's not yet another proposal on euro bonds or safe bonds, because there are so many around that we didn't want to kind of add another one. The whole point of the paper is to try to show why a safe asset, or call it Eurobond or safe bond, together with central fiscal capacity is absolutely essential to address the issue that I just mentioned. So lack of fiscal capacity at the national level and inability to provide fiscal stimulus when needed, the doom loop between the banks and the governments, and the only way to address this issue, in our view, is to introduce both some fiscal capacity and safe asset. I won't go into the details, but just to show you two graphs, this is a sort of simulation of what would have happened during the government debt crisis had the Eurozone a fiscal capacity and a safe bond available, which was not the case really. And you see the baseline, which is the gray line, is what the model says with a shock, which is comparable with the one we saw during the crisis. The red bars are what would happen after the introduction in the model of a safe asset and fiscal capacity. So it's basically it's a way to offset or absorb shocks. I have to say that it is what is called Pareto efficient or welfare enhancing for all countries in Europe, so including Germany and core Europe, and so it is beneficial for the core and the periphery, and it is particularly useful if the shock is a demand shock, as all policy instruments, both monetary and fiscal policy, if the shock is a supply side shock, and we'll get back to this because today's shock is partly a supply side shock. And so monetary and fiscal policy are not very useful if the shock is a supply side shock. But again, if it is a demand shock, mainly demand shock, having a safe pass and fiscal capacity can limit the damage in terms of output, in terms of all other variables. And here you can see also some government variables, so basically reduce the effect on public accounts and also reduce the need for the ECB to intervene with asset purchases. Now let me move on to Italy. How many control? Move to Italy. We are talking about how to reverse the course of Italy's decline. As you can see here, that's the story of the past 20 years. Italy was not behaving particularly well, I would say, in the 90s. Okay, there was a big debate in the 90s about the decline of Italy. Okay, so that was already quite topical back then. But since the crisis, as you can see, there has been a negative leg, first leg due to the global crisis, and then a second leg due to the sovereign debt crisis. Italy's GDP is still 5 percentage points below the pre-crisis peak today, and it's almost 20 percentage points below the Eurozone ex-Italy, and it is 20 percentage points below the trend line, just drawing trend line before the crisis. So Italy has never recovered effectively, okay? And it's still in very bad shape. Now, if you see the dotted line at the end here, I'm trying to kind of figure out what could be the effect of the coronavirus. And I had 3 scenarios, the baseline in the middle, and then 2 extremes. But I won't go into that specifically. Now, there has been a steady improvement in employment, which is good news here, especially the red line, although labor participation has increased as well, which should be good news. Not good news for productivity, but good news for the economy. And as a result, unemployment has declined, but not much. So the unemployment, as you can see here, it was down to below 6% before the crisis, and has moved up to 13% at some point, and is still close to a double digit right now, slightly below 10%. Now, what is the situation in Italy? As I mentioned at the beginning, even in Italy, before the outbreak of the coronavirus, there was some rebound underway, and you see here some indicators. The PMIs that I presented before, the composite PMI, which includes also the services sector, and the Itacoin, which is a coincident indicator provided by the Bank of Italy. And you see they all point to some form of rebound. Unfortunately, we don't have data for the past few days, so I'm pretty sure that there will be a big hit here in the next few days. And this is again the same graph showing the shock on credit, which to me is one of the big issues. There are many structural issues in Italy, but one of the issues following the crisis was also the transmission of monetary policy through the banking channel. And there are several lines here. One is related to non-financial corporations, and the other one is non-financial corporations plus households. And there is also another line which is related to the same series net of securitization, because the Bank of Italy does some estimate and strip out the securitization. So basically, if the bank has non-performing loans in its balance sheet and decides to sell the position, it's no longer considered as a loan, but it's still a loan. Okay, it's packaged in the portfolio of some asset manager, but it's still a loan. So you might say, okay, that's still a loan. So you have to add up the securitized and non-performing loans. Having said that, some of these companies are no longer in business, so I would say probably the truth is somewhere in the middle. Okay, but again, the situation is pretty bad. Having said that, then we deserve a full presentation of maybe several hours. Italy has structural issues, and the way to summarize the structural issues is to look at productivity. And you see here, labor productivity has not improved. Actually, if you look at 2018, which is the last annual number we have, it's a negative territory. It's partly the reflection of some improvement in the labor market. We have to acknowledge that Italy went through a significant reform of the labor market, one of the few positive things that the past governments have done. And that has produced positive results, in my view. So employment has improved, which is good news. But to some extent, this is the kind of mirror image of productivity. So productivity has, to some extent, declined because of that, which is not good news. What this whole leads to? Clearly, Italy has a problem because it's vulnerable to shocks, both because of lack of instruments at European level and also constrained policies domestically. So effectively, as I said, due to the high debt to GDP, there's not much fiscal leeway. What is the way that investors look at Italy at the moment? Okay, let's forget about the current situation. Let's focus on the medium term. What is the situation in the medium term? Italy, according to international organizations, over the medium term, not today, is credited with potential growth between, say, 0.5 percentage point and 0.8. Not a big deal, okay, not a big, I would be happy to see that growth, by the way, but that's what is kind of estimated by international organizations at the moment. If on top of that you put 1.9, which is, the inflation target by the ECB, so close to but below 2%, you end up with nominal growth over the medium term of 2.4, 2.7. Now, in the usual, equation of that dynamics, if you have interest rates moving down below nominal growth for a sustained period of time, then your debt to GDP starts moving down. If you have a decent primary surplus, Italy's primary surplus is still close to 1.5%, then it's okay. So what I'm saying here basically is if you have a long enough period of low interest rates, Italy's debt to GDP will start moving down, okay? The problem is that if you have another shock on economic growth, at least in the near term, it's going to shoot up again. That's inevitable, okay? So the real point here, the real question mark is whether growth is going to be hit again, and maybe not just temporarily, maybe there is some damage on the supply side as well, and that leads to some reduction in potential, which would be pretty bad. Or at some point you see an increase in interest rates. Both ways, Italy would run into problems. Other issues of Italy you can see here. The previous government introduced, a counter-reform of pensions. And luckily enough, they didn't have the money to finance it, okay? So they financed the reform only for 3 years. And so the little bump that you see in the black line here is the reform introduced last year. So it is worsening the situation for a while on the assumption that the current government let the reform expire. We go back to the previous scenario. But the big problem here is another one, is the fact that if there is no change in the demography and no change in pension provisions, as a percentage of GDP, pension spending will continue to increase for a number of years, which is, as you can imagine, a big issue. The population is getting older and older. This graph shows you what is called the old dependency ratio. So basically, 65 years old and above, over 15 and 64, and you see that Italy is well above the other countries, at least before the coronavirus issue. Here you see also another big issue, which is the capital expenditure. When you have a big crisis, the easy bit for local administrators is not to cut on current expenditure, which would mean firing civil servants, which is not legally possible, by the way. And so what they do big issue. Finally, let me say that to complicate matter even more, Italy has put some question marks on its own participation in monetary union with the previous government. So suddenly, investors woke up last year and discovered that there is some risk of Italy leaving the Eurozone. And you guess what? Spreads widen because of that. Now, there are ways, I won't go into the details, there are ways to estimate the default probabilities and the premium given by, added by investors on spreads due to the risk of redenomination, so-called redenomination. And you see here that at some point went higher. Now, luckily enough, it's going down again. But again, we will see what happens after this crisis. I think I stop here, and I'm happy to respond to answer your questions also on the structural side in the Q&A.
Thanks. There you go. All right, I will try to be brief, and in order to allow times for question, what I will do, and you'll forgive me, I'll be a bit telegraphic, that I'll make a bunch of sentences. First of all, I think that the data that Lorenzo showed make it extremely clear that the problem is in fact structural. There's a confusion, and it's a persistent and growing confusion in the economic policy debate of keeping insisting on short-term policy, fiscal, monetary, and then showing graphs that clearly display very long-run trends. This is not to be interpreted as a criticism of Lorenzo. Lorenzo is well within the dominant way of thinking, which thinks in terms of shocks. And having been playing macroeconomics for a while, I believe that the word shock should be abolished, because everything has become a shock. So if you think at the last few graphs, the pension problem. Pension problem means that there is a transferring of resources of produced income from the working people to the non-working people, which is an increasing and very large share of national income every year. This creates obvious disincentive to work, produce, and in particular invest in Italy and employ Italians of high productivity. I am quite sure that one of the reasons some of you are here is because of that. It's because out of 100 you produce and cost your firm, the British pension system takes away a smaller fraction, a much smaller fraction than the Italian system would. That's the structure. That's not a shock. That's nothing to do with fiscal policy in the sense of maneuvering G and T and T or tau, whatever symbol you like to use. It's a problem that is 40 years old, and that actually, let me give you some bad news. The current government, Lorenzo showed the bump produced by the so-called quota 100, and the fact that because it's expiring, it should go down and then go back to the bad old trend. Well, that bump will be extended. Everything in the planning is that they'll invent some quota 101 with the dalla, with the dogs, and some movie there. And it's a structure. The same is true for the data on investment. When it goes up. And finally, what's most issues, and I'm allowed here to disagree, there is a very simple, natural, and consistent with data way of interpreting the stagnation in credit flows in the Italian system, which has nothing to do with monetary policy. It has to do with the fact that if you have an economy that is unable to produce profitable opportunities for investment because of structural reason, because a large class of investment are not profitable in the country, then no decent banker will ever lend, no matter how little it costs to lend. Because even if it costs me zero, even if it costs me negative to lend, if you lose 30% of what I gave you, I'm in trouble. All right? And the only way I can cover from the fact that there is a high risk you lose 30% of what I lend you is that I charge you at 10%, but then at 10%, very few investment opportunities are available that are profitable. And that explains the equilibrium outcome. It's nothing to do with shocks. It has to do with the long-run structural characteristic of the Italian economy. And if you want, with a long-run structural characteristic of Italian banks, that nevertheless, from that point of view, once you account for the NPL crisis, post, both financial first and then debt crisis of the early 10s, and in spite of its inefficiency, it's not particularly different from other. Yes, foreign banks are not very present in Italy. There is a large market dominance of national banks, but there are enough foreign banks that use methods and techniques and are managed differently than Italian banks, and they don't seem to be lending any different from what national banks are. So, and you could keep going on, and so the issue is that Italian problems are all structural. The rest that has to do with the stage of the cycle, I will maybe want to postpone it for later discussion, but let's keep in mind that cycles do end, in the sense that expansions do end. It's not automatic, there is no practice or our understanding of history and data that suggests that we may miraculously think at expansions lasting forever. Eventually something somewhere is bound to go wrong, and when a number of things go wrong together, well, then expansion ends, and that actually serves a very useful purpose because it allows you to correct the mistakes, to take away investment from where you made mistakes, to do things differently, to move people from one sector to another, and so on. We could go discussing, in fact, why this expansion has lasted so long, the longest by far at this point of the post-war period, at least in the US and all around the world, with Europe behaving, and as Lorenzo, I think, quite correctly has pointed out at the beginning, in a fairly schizophrenic way. A piece of Europe is in the world, maybe not growing as fast as other countries in the world, but you would not expect France to have the speed of growth of southern China or even Korea, would not even be reasonable, but growing at a decent pace and keeping up with the rest, keeping up with the Jones. And then there is a piece of Mediterranean Europe, of which we are obviously the major part, and Greece is the second part. Spain, unable to decide where they belong. They've been struggling, as you may or may not know. I have a certain familiarity with Spain, having lived and operated there, and having also played a public role for a number of years between 2005 and 2014. And one of my lines in editorials was always, you guys better make up your mind. You want to be Italy or you want to be Germany? And the Spaniards haven't decided. And they're right now trying to hurt themselves with these Catalonian issues and the various hysteria on both sides, I would say. But anyhow, so they're there, undecided as to what their future should be. So this brings me to the fact that the problem of Italy is very old. When we look at, so Lorenzo closed, I think correctly, mentioning productivity. You know, if you look at productivity, I like to look at productivity in the proper form and then expand from the core. And so when I look at productivity, I look at TFP. When I look at Italian, so TFP, let me tell you what it is for those that are not into the jargon. TFP is, think about what your productivity per capita is in a country. It grows for two reasons. Because it's per capita, it certainly doesn't grow because you work harder, because it's still you, okay? It's per hour worked. So forget about humans. Sometimes GNP goes up just because more humans work, even if they do fairly unproductive jobs that produce very little, but still the total grows. Income per capita does not, okay? It may grow because your capital stock increases, not improves, increases. Where there was a truck, you use two. Where there was a tractor, you use two, something like that. That does contribute. But what we have learned for centuries now, was the gigantic contribution of Joseph Schumpeter to our understanding of how the world goes, is that if you keep adding the same tractor, you don't go very far. Among other things, because one worker with a certain ability, the third tractor, he doesn't really know what he's doing, and he might crash. And so that's as much. So when you look at variation in stock of capital, basically, that's the part of labor productivity or income per capita, same thing, that you can explain. And then when you look at data, you notice that a gigantic amount of variations, in the case of Italy, we have to say variation. If we were saying United States, we would say growth. But variations in income per capita or productivity per hour worked cannot be explained by capital stock variation. First, because there is not much of it, and second, because in any case it doesn't add up with the numbers. This is not true only for Italy, it's true everywhere. Okay? It's explained by some kind of technological change, which means everything. It means entrepreneurial innovation, changing methods of production, producing new things, working better, having more specialized guys, having a more efficient health system, having a more efficient transportation system, having a more efficient judicial system, blah, blah, blah. All the things that allow you to do things better, to get more bangs for the buck, more usable output, stuff you can enjoy out of the same effort you put into the work, okay? We call that power factor productivity. It's just a misnomer. You can call it bingo, bango, bongo. I don't really care. You know why? Because it's a garbage can where you throw everything you cannot measure. But you know what it is? It is that you change the methods of production, you produce better things, you did things differently. Because everything else, that's what you call innovation and blah, blah, blah. Well, that number has been flat in Italy since the middle 70s. It's nothing to do with the euro, it does not. Since in a period that goes, obviously statistics is statistics, you have to be careful there. Confidence interval, so I'm not going to give you a date, April 7, 1978. Okay? But in the years that go between 75, 76 and 80, 81, that time series that before it was going up, showing, Italians are doing better at doing the stuff, they were changing methods, becoming more expert, becoming more capable, studying more, becoming more technically expert, was flat. Just flat. It's 45 years that is just flat. Actually, here's the news. It's actually been going down in the last 15. All right? Well, that's it. It's the synthesis. Obviously, then we can go look at the whole complex of things. But if you want, as they call, I guess somebody here knows statistics, if you want a summary statistics, you start from there. Then you start breaking it down and look at the determinants. Sure, no time to do that in the 12, 13 minutes I have, right? So that's the problem. The problem is invariably structure. And before, when we had a cup of tea before coming here, the friends that organized this talk said, do you think there is hope? My answer is no. And nevertheless, we have to believe there is no. So this is going to be si parva licet componere maior. Professor Bifis, may I use Latin even in front of an accountant? I'm allowed. Professor Paolo Bifis is a distinguished banking professor. He taught me banking and economics at Ca' Foscari many years ago. So nice to have Paolo here. And so si parva licet componere maior. That's the way I think it should be said. You see, what we actually have to face is a very long-run problem in which we have to be absolutely pessimistic from the rational point of view and optimistic because there is no alternative of being optimistic. You got to give it a try. If you don't want to give it a try, not only you do what I suppose most of you or all of you did, and I did, and I think, I'm not sure Lorenzo did, but probably is somewhere in doing, that is leave, but also throw away the passport and forget about the language and forget, and just literally and, you know, religiously go back only for summer vacation, not even that. Okay, so to the extent you haven't done that, then we have to be like Antonio Gramsci. That was my comparison. You have to be pessimistic because rationality says we should, and nevertheless we have to give it a try. So let me give you the pessimistic part, because the optimistic part is obvious, which is give it a try. But in order to give it a try, you better start from a very realistic analysis of what the problem is. And so that's why I'm a bit sanguine about the fact it's not a matter of fiscal policy, it's not a matter of monetary policy, it's not a matter of shocks. It's a long story, and the Italians that wants to think about it better be courageous and brave in the public debate and say, let's stop talking about 0.2 you know, violation of the whatever budget limits, or let's increase of, let's do a manovra of 3 billion so that we actually generate, you know, like this, I'm gonna start to get sanguine, like this very nice gentleman that they have put at Palazzo Chigi to enjoy his life, that goes around, oh, you know, even the European Commission says that the reddito di cittadinanza increased GNP of 0.1. Yes, Dodo, but it costs us 0.4 of GNP, which means you lost 0.3. You just threw it away to the garbage, all right? And you see, you have to be very explicit. You got to tell them in face that they're lying. I know it sounds rude. A good Italian doesn't do that. We're all well behaved. I'm not, okay? And I'm proud of it. And I actually do it on purpose. It's a country that needs to wake up and smell the coffee, which in fact is typically made by Starbucks. All right, good. So what's the problem? What is the long run history? Let's look at the two aspects of it. One is really long run. We better understand that there is a cultural struggle to be carried out, and it has to be carried out by every single individual that is aware of it. And that's the way you become an elite. That's the way you become a leading class. And the long run struggle started in 1400. I'll make the history of Italy for the last 600 in 2 minutes. In 1400, Italy was at the top of the world. No doubt about it. In pretty much every dimension, not only income per capita, wealth per capita, but culture, alphabetization, technological advances, everything. I don't think there is a single relevant dimension other than military, that's relevant, in which Italy in 1400 was behind anywhere in the world, China included. Then, and this is where the 2 minutes constraint is taken as an excuse, so I won't debate why. If you want, we can. A long half millennium plus of decline started, with bumps from time to time that showed something that could bring us back to the growing path. Somehow the leadership of the world shifted from northern Italy to northern Europe, and we got pulled with them a bit. We never became China, quite significantly. About the same time China decline starts. Geography helped. The driving forces moved to northern Europe, did not move to, say, southern Africa or northern India or Mongolia. You'd say, well, ridiculous, sure. The historical circumstances were such, but from enough, you know, if you start thinking about it, you realize that it's a kind of chance, a lucky chance that Italy gets there, so it doesn't really fall behind as much as China did over that half millennium. But it did fall behind. You know, all you have to read is to read Goethe and the travelers from Northern Europe visiting Italy in 1800. They were going to the safari. They were going to the anthropological trip. It was anthropology in the making. And I'm not kidding, I'm serious. It was anthropological exercise. Let's go out there, savage. Oh, they live in splendid places. You know, they have the forum, but the forum is totally abandoned, and so on. And that's a trend. There are bumps, there are moments, you know, the pre-Napoleonic period, the peace of 1700, Carlos III has certain influence, blah, 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 all you want. And the unification of the Italian kingdom. But even there, and I've dedicated lots of time in the last couple of years to studying those years that go between 1860 and 1945, and especially before the the start of World War II. If you look at the political and social history of those years, you see exactly the problems we are talking about now. A miserable living class, a very small industrial class, totally connected to the royal house, a public administration that is SHITTY from the start, and so on and so forth. Regional division, corruption, blah, blah, blah. You say, well, it's also in France. Yes, but this is an Engels moment. You know, sometimes quantitative difference becomes qualitative. And the quantitative differences there are so huge that they become qualitative. The creation of the state, the decision to invest in education. Italy comes so late, I think it's the Casati law, you know, to public education 6 to 9, when there are all the trends that explain why you're behind. And in fact, from this point of view, right now there is this discussion about, oh, but we had the Italian miracle. Yes, but the Italian miracle was an historical exception. That was a shock. The shock was called the war, the fact that all the country had become fascist, the fact that almost all the leading class, bourgeoisie, industrialists, high-ranking public officers, intellectuals. Remember the famous the number of intellectuals that signed for the regime? All of that. Well, where the number that didn't, you know, approaches aside, 3, 4, 11, right? And then a bunch of others ran away. That's the initial, you know, they're talking about the brain, what is that called? Diaspora? Well, it started with Benito. It didn't start with Alberto Lesina or me 40 years ago. It started way earlier. We were just following up on, you know, Modigliani. Those are the beginning. Then there is this bomb, and the bomb is what? That for a brief period, mano militari de facto, the Allied forces and the CLN imposed as political leaders of the country a group of people of various extraction, including the communists, that were special. You look at their history, you look at their CV, so to speak, you look at what they did, and you realize that they were exceptions because there was something that had selected them in a very anomalous way. They had been anti-Italians in the sense that they decided to do what typically we have not in our DNA of our culture. They decided to go against the gigantic majority of the country. They decided in a situation which, and this was true for the Republican, Partito d'Azione Liberali, for the Socialists, for the Communists, for the Democratic Christians. It was true for all of them. You know, they had different ideologies and different values. You know, some communists wanted to do like in Russia, sure, but they had one characteristic. They stood tall and told their co-citizens, hey, look, I know I'm in a very small minority, but you know what? I disagree, and I'll be against. And then eventually even did. So it's true that, militarily speaking, the CLN was no big deal. That without the Allied forces, that, you know, it would have gone otherwise. But it was a very important political and cultural element. It qualified a small group of people to become the new leading class, and the effort was visible. That's the sense in which the late 40s, the 50s, and the 60s in Italy are an exception, because there is an exceptional, in the sense of saying, selected leading class controlling the thing. And it's not 100% perfect, because unfortunately, because of political constraint, the fear of the communist, all that, you know, there was no defascistization. As we all know, the state apparatus was not clean of the monarchic and fascist element. There was a gigantic continuity, and that mattered. In fact, there was, and that's probably the unfortunate historical part, there was a cleaning only at the very top. Well, one thing I know very well is how the Frankization, how the Spanish state was changed after Franco. Much more radical cleaning on the ministry, much more radical cleaning of the judiciary, much more radical. No particular violence. They even had their party, but the very top of the public just went. Retired. Goodbye. See you. You're not going to choose your follower. You're not going to choose. That didn't happen. Which is why what we just observed, and it's going on since the 80s, is very simple. It's called regression to the mean. We better put it in, so we better understand this. We are regressing to our historical trend and position. It's not true. You see, when I hear people say, oh, give me back the Prima Repubblica, well, you know, I'll tell you what. The point is that what we are being, the current level, the current quality of the elite class ruling Italy is just average. It's not true that Di Maio is so bad. It's not so different from what would have come up before him in the 50s had not been for the CLN. It's not different from the average prefetto or what they call podestà in the Ventennio. It's not so different from the kind of level you find in Italian politics in the late 19th century. Yeah, they were a bit more elaborate, they were all upper class, they had some style, they smoked the pipe or a cigar more elegantly and wore very nice tweed. They all had their clothes cut by Borelli, I suppose, or Kitton. But apart from that, I'm sure that Di Maio now can also afford some fashionable shop in Napoli. But the point is that if you look at the culture, the knowledge, the capability, think at our military. You know, you go to look at the history of our military, realize that there is one common thread in all the disaster: incompetence. Pompous assholes at the top, pretending they knew what they were doing and having no idea what they were doing, just having hundreds of thousands of Italian farm workers being killed while they ride the horses. I'm not mean to be this, it's the history that it is. Let's look at it. That's our leading class. And it's not that we can change it overnight, but we better be aware that if we want to change a little bit of it, not all, a little bit of it, we have to know what we are up against. Okay, that's the history. Then there is a second one, and I finish. It's called globalization, but it's here. You see, there is something in this long-run trend or aversion to the mean, then something does happen in the 80s and 90s, which is technological change around the world and this is fairly secondary that China entered the market. China entering the market and China entering the world made that even more abrupt, but it would have gone the same way. The technology of transportation, communication, mobility of human and things change and allows people like you, and before you people like me, to say, you know what, in Venice I cannot flourish. In Venice I have somebody like my advisor that tries to, you know, use me, doesn't want to let me compete and get rewarded. I'll go work somewhere else. It's not the 1950s anymore. I'll go work somewhere else. It's okay. They're okay, those Americans. They don't eat pasta decently, but I can teach them. And, you know, they can even make Starbucks to make me happy. I think that was the reason, right? In the early 80s, a bunch of us started moving that, and Starbucks came out. You know, from causality point of view, I think Granger caused Starbucks. The Italian brain flow to the United States, Granger caused Starbucks. I mean, the correlation is perfect and clear that Starbucks shareholders should owe us some money. Without us, they would have never invented that all that. And so, this is actually the second and more serious, from a rational point of view, factor that makes me pessimistic in the short medium run, and that says if you're into this, if you're interested, get ready for a very long trip. Which is what? That is a world reallocation of talents. People, I don't know if there are people here that study economic geography or international trade, or how factors get allocated over how, you know, comparative advantage are endogenous and depend on absolute advantage in providing service and competitive environment. So there's all literature there. I learned in graduate school from my teacher Ronald Jones that was mentioning this in 1983-84. You know, that they say, okay, economics is good for nothing. Ronald seen it all. He said, well, what we're going to see is gigantic reallocation of factors of production and talents, and they're going to cluster where it's more convenient for them because they become very mobile. The standard model of international trade, again, I don't know if people are familiar with that, but the standard model of international trade, that has to be thrown away today because it assumes the comparative advantage are given. That is, you know, you have the sun and the hills of Portugal. That's why you're particularly good at making wine, right? You have the given from nature, water and sheep and of England, which is why particularly we're making cotton wools and things like that. It's no longer true, right? That you're good at making 5G, or you're good at making new medicine, or you're good at writing software. Where you are doesn't really depend on anything given by nature. It depends on the fact that the place is attractive. And what you do, you go where the place is attractive. If it is sunny and nice and efficient, and it's north of San Jose, better. But even if it is not north of San Jose, it's in Shenzhou, which is frankly a pretty shitty place. Okay, with due respect to my friend from Shenzhou, but I'm sure they're not listening. They're all locked up at home, by the way. So, no, actually, no. Guangdong. I just got communication today. Guangdong is open back to business. 2/3 of the stuff is back. There are a bunch of provinces that are opening. But hey, guys. That's it. But that's the problem. So what is going on? That we have lost that trade. And it's a process been going on for the last 30 years. You are the living sample. You know why you're here, and you know exactly why what I'm saying is true. And it's not that you're anti-patriotic or nasty or anything, or esterophile, anti-Italian. No, actually, I'm sure each and every one of you, like me, would rather have been in Venice, or Como, or Caltanissetta, or wherever you come from. I have no idea. But at the end, you said, hey, you know what? If I stay here, I die. I don't realize myself. There is no way this environment allows me to flourish. Let me go where they treat me decently. That's what I did. I'm sure that's what you will do. So, but this is now become, in the days in which I experienced it, there was a small number of people, I remember. And not only economics, they were mostly academics. Now it's no longer. And it's been not for the last 20 years at least. Now it's everything. Right? I just checked in on my hotel. The young man checking me in and doing quite professionally the job, much more professionally than any hotel, say in Venice, was clearly Italian. He had perfect English, even less accent than me. I have a very strong Venetian accent, I know. But he was clearly Italian. Eventually, I had to tell him. Yeah, you too, because I saw your passport. I gave him the American passport just to make sure this COVID thing, there was no issue. So that's the thing, and when we have to think, we have to be realistic. In the great redistribution in the world of ability to produce and factors of production and skill, Italy is out of that. It's out of the top. Can it get back in? Maybe. Could it do with fiscal policy, with idiocies like let's take away taxes for 3 years from the pizzaiolo in Rotterdam that come back to Salerno? And he has a degree in science of communication. Remember, it was only for laureate. So that, hundreds of people with pizzaioli with degree in psychology went back. So, well, you're a laureate and got 3 years. No, we know perfectly, you don't need economics to understand that that's not what matters. In order to get that thing reversed, you need to have some distinguished university decide to open a campus in Italy because it's convenient. Some leading pharmaceutical firm that says, I'll start a research center in Matera or Ancona or whatever, or Padova, and things like that. Some big bank that says, well, I'll move my research department away from London because of Brexit, but I'll go to Torino. Okay? But in order to get that, you need to create the conditions. And the conditions are structured. And as long as you don't create that, there is no short-run little story of this or the other subsidy that will do it. So that's what we're up against. We were up against a long-run history of Italy dwindling away from the leading part of the world, with these bumps, fortunately, due to the Alps that like a zip keeps us attached, right? We don't drift in the Mediterranean. And this now short-run, but almost half a century old, process of globalization. What do you want to do with that? I don't know, I'll stop here, but that's the problem where we're from. The rest is just being optimistic.
Thanks a lot for this very insightful presentations. Now we open the floor for questions. I start from Oreste, well, in the organization of the event. Yes.
Thank you, Bob, for the very interesting points that you made. I want to elaborate on what Michele was saying regarding the political issues, the structural issues. And I want to talk about sharing with you a personal experience of a political failure more than 30 years ago. Lessons that I learned at the time, that I think are more and more relevant. And it is exactly the reason why I decided with a group of friends both to come back to politics. I don't want to be a politician, so no worries. I'm not looking for votes, not interested at all. And also to organize these seminars, to basically to instigate a debate. My personal opinion is that, as Michele was saying, but also in a sense also as Lorenzo was saying, there are structural issues in Italy. So the debate is not really about measures of policy, but more about politics, i.e. distribution of power, how power is transmitted from one generation to the other, and how it is controlled by a very small group of individuals. And my experience that I want to share with you, as I was saying, is more than 30 years ago. When in my early years, I invested nearly 15 years, from 1977, into politics, into a small political party that probably many of you, or most of you, do not know, the Republican Party. And in the mid-80s, in my hometown, in Torino, there was only one university in the entire region. So there was a major issue related to the institutions around the university, like colleges, cafeterias, libraries. Issue which was very relevant because most of the students who was attending the university were coming from outside the city. And many of them, obviously, they were not supported by a well-off family. So it was a major issue. So we decided to investigate into this problem. At the time, Michele knows him, and also Marcello knows him. The leading person of the group was Oscar Giannino, probably name I didn't know. And also the other guy was Mauro Marino, who is now a senator with Renzi. We decided to focus on this issue. So cafeterias, colleges, libraries. So we spent 12 months searching for the answer to understand why it was not working. And we clearly found signs of corruption and inefficiency. The region was run by a coalition of 5 parties, and this particular department was controlled by a socialist. So we decided to try to change things. We put together a group of professors from the University of Torino, many from the Faculty of Economics and Law. We put together a project of law, regional law, to change the way the sector was managed. Initially, we had very strong enthusiasm behind, and then all of a sudden we started to find obstacles. Things were going very slow, and in the end the project was killed. Why? For political reasons, because to accuse a socialist, who was obviously a very important partner of the coalition, was basically meaning to put the coalition in trouble at the regional level and at the national level. So the process was killed. And it was a very, very huge disappointment for us at the time. You can imagine, we were in our mid-20s, early 20s. Yeah, early 20s. So at the time I was at university, early 20s. It was a huge disappointment. 2 lessons from that experience, which I think is very relevant if any of you is interested in doing some politics. First, first big mistake, that we were under the illusion of changing the system from within. And that was part of the strategic mistake also from the Republican Party. Because for many years they were trying to change the system from within, but at the end it got completely crushed between the socialists, the Christian Democrats, and the Communist Party. The other big mistake that we made, and I'm very much aware after my last 2 years of doing politics with the radicals, is that we didn't address our natural constituency, i.e. the students. We didn't look for the power of the multitude, the power of the many. We always tried a very institutional way to change things, i.e. through the regional council, through the political parties. And we got killed, basically, completely killed. It was a huge disappointment, which led me then, a few years later, to decide to leave Italy, to stop doing politics for many years, until 2013. I stopped completely doing politics. I decided that I wanted to focus on my own personal style. So these are lessons that I learned, which are really very much what Michele was saying. In Italy, I think the issue is a political issue. The way power is allocated and the way power is transmitted from one generation to the other. My question that I would like to pose is because obviously the main purpose of these seminars is not just to have an intellectual debate. The main purpose of these seminars is really to instigate a debate, to find ways forward for the future. Because I'm pessimistic, as Michele was saying, but at the same time, I'm very optimistic about the future. And my main source of inspiration on this front, as Michele was saying, is Gramsci, no doubt. So, what can we do? Since we have a limited time now, I'm turning 58, I decided that I want to allocate a lot of time in what I have forward, whatever is time that I have, to find ways to help growing a political movement which hopefully one day will be able to turn things around. Turn the table, as I say, because that's the problem that we have. We have to turn the table upside down. What can we do? What is, apart from obviously watching the activities of groups that exist, following the activities of Michele or Marco Cappato, other people like that, what can we do concretely to work in that direction, step by step?
You want to reply to this, or should we collect a couple more?
I have a very simple reply. I have no idea.
Okay. Let's see what you think.
Just keep repeating what you think is
Many
right.
questions and not much time. Don't share
As always.
Over there, I see many.
Not gonna go there. Not gonna go there. Okay. By the way, it's called a gelato or a cone because you have to stick it in your mouth. I had to explain even to Elsa Fornero the other day. You really stick it. It's in coronavirus days. I know you'll be afraid, but otherwise you might as well not use it.
I'll keep it close, but I'm not going to leave it. All right. So, well, thank you very much for your introductions. I found particularly interesting the succinct yet efficient analysis that you made of the trend in politics. And you went very far back into the 14th century, well, starting from the 14th century. But I might have missed the point. My question is, how can we revert that trend, the trend of a political class that is just not working and hasn't been really working, apart from minor exceptions or major exceptions, if you will, occasionally? How do we break this trend? And what can we concretely do as activists, as non-activists?
Seems the same question or as they just asked, only shorter. You see why people don't like me?
No, it's because why people like you.
But more than an answer, just an opinion would be enough.
I said, just keep telling. I don't know if Lorenzo has some ideas that are more structured. I think that when you face something and you recognize it for what it is, and it is an historical, cultural problem, the only thing you can keep doing is trying to push the problem into the debate. It's not even into the debate. Nobody talks about this. No official intellectuals talk about this. Everybody shut up about this. There is omerta. You understand? There is I don't want to sound like one of these crazy nuts that think it's a complotto. In economics, thanks to our understanding of mass behavior, we call it an equilibrium.
Yes.
It's true. They're observationally equivalent. If everybody believes the same norm, and if everybody respects the same norm, and everybody knows what the other expects from them, they'll behave in such a way that they're actually coordinated, that they met at night and they arrange, the thing on their head, how to do things. But it's not like that. It's a matter when you have a sequence of a set of beliefs, culture, values, and norms, and there are players that enforce it. Look at the way Italian media are used and manipulated. Okay? Then you have an equilibrium. And the equilibrium looks like a complotto, but it's not a complotto. It's an equilibrium. How to break an equilibrium? It's complicated. For now, the only thing I can think of is if you have arguments to say them. If you have the backbone to say publicly, you're a liar, that's not the problem, you're hiding this and that, say that. But I don't have anything better than that. People say, oh, but the Italian leading economic, the poor, all the industrialists, poor guys, they're all taxed. Let's look at the Italian media. Who owns them? RAI is owned by the political class. The rest is owned by an entrepreneur. And he even has shareholders, right? La Sette is owned by an entrepreneur. Repubblica is owned by, was owned by Carlo De Benedetti until the other day, now it's owned by the Agnellis. Messaggero is owned by Caltagirone. Help me, please. Corriere is owned by another entrepreneur, the same that owned La Sette. La Stampa, Agnelli's, I think they changed now, I forgot. But anyway, it's not true that the Italian media system is owned by some foreigner or some enemy of the private enterprise or some people that don't invest in Italy. It's actually owned by the Italian capitalists. Evidently, they like to have the Corriere della Sera that we have. That looks like a porno magazine without tits. Right? And so when that's an equilibrium. It's not that they call each other. Caltagirone didn't call Cairo and said, hey, I'll have bullshit on Messaggero if you have bullshit on Corriere della Sera. No, they both respond to a system of incentives.
Professor, would you like to add something on this?
No, they are more than explicit. No, sorry.
Well, I have to say that I enjoyed a lot of the colorful presentation by Michele Quadrini. I mean, I'm usually the critical guy, okay? So, but you are, maybe because I worked 9 years as a civil servant. When it's a little bit over the top, I tend to react to Italy's bashing. So to kind of counterbalance and be a bit more balanced on the assessment. So let me say that it's not everything black and white. Okay, so it's not everything on the black side rather than the white side. That there are some positive news as well, because despite all the troubles that Italy went through the crisis and because of structural issues, I don't want to say that. I'm one of the few things that I fully agree with you is that Italy has structural issues. However, on top of that, it means that if you have structural issues, your ability to respond to shocks is somewhat undermined. That was my whole point, okay? And don't forget that when Italy went through the crisis of 2008, 2009, more important 2011, and the shock had an impact on the supply side, meaning that Italy lost potential growth. And when you lose potential growth, then it's difficult to recover it, okay? So in other words, if you have a shock, you can actually undermine also your structural position as well. Having said that, you don't need to be a genius to know what needs to be done, because if you take what the international organizations say, let's say IMF, the OECD, the European Commission, over the past 10, 15 years, there are very clear recommendations. Now, you might have slightly different views. You might put the emphasis on some issues compared to the others. But say 80–90% of the recommendations, I think it should be partisan in the sense they should be taken as positive by all parties, by political parties, and I think we should, everybody should agree with that. So what's the problem? The problem, unfortunately, it is partly political, and it's difficult to solve because whenever you do something in terms of structural reforms, you impinge on specific interests. And when specific interests are well organized and they are widespread, you reach a point of no return effectively, because it's difficult to reform anything, because whenever you take an initiative, you have so many vested interests and so many lobbyists that can actually, obstruct the attempt and sometimes make the attempt completely useless. Having said that, there are some positive news. If we look back over the past 10, 15 years, there have been some improvements in some areas, okay? So it's not everything is black, and there are, at the end of the day, the economy is still quite dynamic on the ground. In other words, there are medium and small size enterprises that, despite all this, despite all the structural issues, despite everything, have survived and actually have thrived. We shouldn't forget that Italy has a very efficient and productive export sector, well above the average of the economy, which is still competing at the global level, still has global niches that do extremely well, even in this situation today, and they continue to perform reasonably well. If you look at the situation of the past 2 or 3 years, actually Italy gained market share globally, despite China, and so there is some underlying strength, which unfortunately is not widespread enough, so it doesn't make for the whole economy, but there are areas of the economy that are, companies that are doing well, and they are, keeping up the country, basically supporting the country, supporting it. And so what needs to be done? I think you are spoiled with choice, because there are so many things that could potentially be done to improve the situation. And again, it's nothing particularly original or nothing new. I mean, again, you turn all the reports by the IMF, the OECD, the Commission, and so forth, and you find the answer. So basically, Italy needs to go through major structural reforms, from product to labor markets. I have to say that on the labor market side, something has been done in the past few years. There are major issues regarding civil justice, as we all know. There are major issues regarding public administration and efficiency of the public administration, which becomes a burden on the rest of the economy. There are issues related to the business environment, which is not conducive to stronger investment activity, because we discussed public investments, but the big chunk is private investment. And why private investment is not improving? There must be a reason, and again, the business environment is certainly to blame because of the situation. So there are plenty of things that can be done. Again, not everything is negative. I think there have been some improvements over the past few years. The problem is that other countries are moving faster, and if you move faster, then you lose in relative terms, and you lose competitiveness. But again, in terms of competitiveness, despite all these problems, a big chunk of the Italian economy, probably not large enough, because the numbers are the one that I presented, but a relatively sizable, and not sizable enough, part of the economy has managed to compete at global level, actually to achieve even better results compared to the past. So that means something. It means that it can be achieved. It can be achieved, and can be achieved even in a situation which remains rather difficult. But I don't want to take too much of your time.
Yeah.
Stop
Thank
here.
you so much for your answer. So we are already over time. I will do a big round of questions, 4 or 5 questions, and you have one final intervention each. You can release the conclusion if you agree with this. Questions? Let's start from the bottom.
How much Europe is protecting Italy? So the opposite of what we heard, that Europe is caused by the climate, but how much Italy is protected by Europe fact that they allow us to not take decision that we should take. For example, allowing us to be flexible, but this is maybe a small amount, but allowing us to behave responsibly in many ways. How much is, or maybe it is something irrelevant for the problem of Italy.
Do we have a question over there? There is one there.
So, idea is certainly for productivity a big matter in Italy is human capital accumulation. And I wanted to ask, especially to Professor Boldrini, how much does he think there is a problem how a school is actually designed, and or rather how much money we put into our schools? Very briefly, I wanted to ask if this trend of Italy being very attractive for working for business is true in all areas, or if in Milan, for example, there is some kind of attempt to become an attractive place for doing business. And if that is true, if that is confirmed by data, if that could be a danger also for the integrity of the country in the long term.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask whether the rise of Rosso-Populismo, basically conspiracy theories becoming mainstream, so like the chemical energy and the fact that Europe was designed to hinder Italian interests, how much this is, let's say, contributing to the overall irrational policy making and completely schizophrenic politics of our country.
Sì, first one.
This is the most dangerous experience. Just to recap, we've been studying one of the many years ago, the structural shock, federalism. Do you think that, apart from the need to do you think that could be one of the things that Italy needs? And second, have you updated your views about federalism over the past 20 years? In a sense, is that what you about to
Do you have any questions from the ladies? Because
He's politically correct.
Yeah, this is the university. Okay, no? So I think we can.
Actually, another question I'm actually asking you.
Very briefly.
Very briefly, yes. I was going to ask you what can we do, but definitely it's not going there. Nothing. I got my own theory.
Call it quits and have a beer. Declare it beer o'clock.
Yeah. That's
the problem is that nowadays the democracy is a short-term democracy. So, despite, for example, China, the long democracy, because of that, can allow long-term projects in order to change and to do better things in a period where the lead for the politician, the only thing for the next election, what actually the government and the leaders should do in order to have a more long-term strategy, even if they are usually worried about short terms.
Yeah, that's
I'll pick up some of them because not all of them. First of all, I forgot to mention education and especially university education, which is absolutely essential for the long-term growth in Italy. But clearly, that is one area that needs to be addressed as much as possible in the future. On Europe, I have to admit that I'm very much pro-European. I'm at the LSE, I'm at the European Institute, by the way. So I'm very much a European, but I'm not without, I'm not saying everything is good, or I'm not saying that everything is doing well. Actually, I'm quite critical of what is happening in Europe as well. In other words, I think Europe is a very fragile construction right now. In other words, it's in the middle of the road. It doesn't want to kind of push towards further integration because of a number of issues. and so it's being in the middle of the road is fragile. So what I said before, and it's not the Italy is responsible for its own destiny, but clearly now Italy is in a construction which has some weaknesses, and is also paying some price for being part of this construction without having really the possibilities to take advantage of some features. Having said that, Italy lost the big opportunities with monetary union because it was not quick enough to adjust its economy to take advantage of a different economic environment. Then, of course, there was the issue of globalization, which Italy didn't manage to leverage on, and that was clearly another problem. But Europe is part of the solution, it's not part of the problem, maybe we would say. In other words, I think Italy should leverage on Europe to solve its own problems. In the past, there used to be what was called vincolo esterno, the external anchor. Italy used to kind of see Europe and the external support as a way to leverage internally and to achieve and deliver structural reforms, but didn't work out very well in many years, I would say. So that's the situation. Finally, fiscal federalism, just a snapshot. I think I'm very much in favor of federalism as a principle, okay, because you kind of move the responsibility at local level where it should where it should be allocated, so you enhance decision making at local level. But let's face it, in Italy it didn't work well. Okay, in 2001, when the big reform was done, the so-called Titolo Quinto, effectively that increased a lot current expenditure at local level without increasing much the efficiency or the return to citizens in terms of public goods and services. So I think there are many lessons that need to be learned out of it, and I think part of the reforms in the future should be rethinking the way the government, the state delivers goods and services to citizens, and rebalance the situation between local and central. That's my feeling.
Thank you. So on Europe, everybody likes to say that they want to have a different Europe. Nobody says what.
I can tell you.
Sure, I'm sure you want European bonds. It's at least Italians have become very good. It's the Renzi approach. I have nothing to say, but I pretend I have something. In fact, the fact is that there's nothing to say for the very simple reason that the leading class of Italy has been completely inert and inactive at the political level at the European stage since the arrival of Mr. Berlusconi in '94. And so all we have to do, and to be frank, is to accept the fact that we've actually been saved by the European Union plentiful times in the 90s and then again in the last decade. And we should start from that point. And that's the way it is. The continuous repetition that it's fragile and this and that, it's good for nothing. It's really good for nothing. In fact, it's good for nothing. You got to play the game. The others do stuff, you do stuff. If you don't do stuff, you count for nothing. All right? And in particular, if apart from not doing anything, you also say things like that, and you say, oh, this is not good, this is not good, and then you beg for money, then you really are worth nothing. All right? So having done the thing that my old friend, now I think he doesn't like me anymore, Ignazio Visco's done, in embarrassing every decent economist and saying this thing on BRRD and then on EMS and then retracting that, is very bad for your reputation. Okay? Playing the role that the Italian elites have played on both those issues of financial integration is very bad for your reputation. There is a rule in politics and diplomacy. They're going to pretend they don't care. They're going to hug you and say, oh, nice, yeah, you're one of us. Obviously, you're going to do that. 60 million people, one of the founding countries, what do you want to do, declare war? No, but then people are going to say, yeah, okay, whatever. The Italians are not contributing. It's a fact. Let's start from there. And I don't think Europe, the so-called European Union, has a bright future in front until some of the issues with leading countries like Italy are addressed. But for now, the only thing I can say is they took care of Italian disaster twice. And as of now, we're tagging along just because they exist and they keep going. If they hadn't, we wouldn't be. All right? That's the way I see it. School, you know my opinions. Yeah, that's one dramatic structure. But until from the students of Italy doesn't come a request for a different school, you know, we can keep saying there are some excellence in the country. Let me actually give a general thing. We called it, I think the name, the use of the word declino started with noise from America. We didn't copyright, we should have. But intellectually, I'm pretty sure, and I'm happy to record, I'm very proud of the work that with Alberto and Sandro and the other did. Back in 2006, when everybody thought we were crazy, we were saying what now, at least in the intellectual group, is accepted, and we said the country's decline. We didn't call it decline by chance. We call it decline because it's a decline, not a collapse. A collapse is that thing that occurs when nothing holds. In Italy, a few things hold. It's thinner and thinner and thinner, and it crumbles and it goes away. And you see, you have to take the long run perspective, the long durée, right? That's the only way you can see it. If you look at day after day, you almost get used, and that's the wrong point of view. So the school. What do you want me to say? It needs to be redone upside down. But until we don't have a demand coming from the student body, from the civil society about redoing it upside down and keep defending that we're so smart, so successful because we study Latin, you know, it's clear, isn't it obvious that the reason? In fact, 7,872 million other people around the world are all more ignorant, ineffective, less innovative than us because they don't study Latin. Right? Look at the Japanese, how dumb they are. Not to speak in this country. Right? They studied Latin and Greek, and they knew about history of philosophy by heart with all the names, Eschilo, etc. Right? They were actually creative and productive as we are. But until you face that kind of diffuse culture, what do you want to talk about? I have been experiencing the Italian university system, one of the top schools. It's okay, but you can see the sideral distance from what it should be. So I don't know what to do there. I think that if you want my forecast, we're going to have emergence of local, the Milano phenomenon. It's going to generalize. Not by chance Bocconi is in Milano. Not by chance Politecnico di Milano is in Milano. And they stand out. And we're going to have similar phenomena in various areas. For example, something that I've been learning a lot recently, medicine. We ought to be proud historically of our medical system, the quality of our medical school. But we have not been observing in every colleague, friend, expert I've been talking to in the last few years that was up there, you know, in the medical system says it's being corroded. In a very short run, we will see our medical system disappearing from the level we have achieved. Because once the generation of the baby boomer, people like me, and shortly after we're retired, right, you'll see that gone. And in fact, now they're finally talking about it. Oh, you know, the doctors are going away, we are short of nurses, we are lack of specialization, so on. Look at the situation here, look at the situation there, we are unprepared, and so on. But if you look at the last data for the last 20, 25 years, you would say that the national health system works pretty well. Which is true, it does. But the animals are eating it from inside. So what we will probably have as an outcome, we will have a bunch of Bocconis for medicine, Bocconis for engineering, that will keep this cluster of excellence in the country. But the country overall will be what it is. So that answer, I think, also the Milano question. That's the process I see. You know, we've been debating this for a long time. It's clear that that's the way it is, but it doesn't. It's a country of 60 million people. Having island here and there of excellence is only like, you know, it reminds me of the Alamo with David Crockett. But General Santana is in front, and you know, Vecchioni has a nice line on that, but nevertheless, in that occasion, Santana won. Then they took revenge and went down to Mexico City, but and that's the situation that we have, which is great obvious to the South. Think of the old debate about the South. Let's face it, the South has progressively become another. It's completely out. And Rome is part of the South, by the way. The South starts south of Rossellini, doesn't start in Napoli, right? Rome is the capital of the South. It's not the capital of the country. The division that was there in the 70s is much bigger now, economically, culturally, behaviorally, from all point of view. We're not talking about that, and we have this silly debate about Milano non restituisci. Right? You understand the level of idiocy that there is behind phrases like that? Where do you want to go with discussion like that? Federalism is gone, it's history. Lorenzo said, oh, they didn't do federalism, they did some shitty thing invented by D'Alema that thought he was going to buy Bossi in that way, and Bossi said, well, yeah, but Berlusconi paid better. He pays cash, okay? And so he said, thank you for the titolo quinto, but I'll get to the election with Mr. Berlusconi. All of a sudden, he's no longer a mafioso because he pays cash. So that thing was a monster, but the discussion of federalism is closed in Italy, kaput. Obviously, I think theoretically it would be relevant, but it's not even worth bringing up. There's no demand, there's not even, we don't even know where to start. It has been a fantastic Machiavellic policy, this of building the region, giving them this enormous amount of money to spend and no responsibility. Because now every local political group wants to keep it. And it's fantastic because moreover, I don't have responsibility. Better than that, impossible, right? So, you know, if there is anybody in Italy that cares about federalism, they can actually go and hang Bossi head down. Because we hope, yeah, you know, the Lega is the first, let me state it clearly, the first party that is responsible for the destruction of any hope in any minimal federal system in Italy is the Lega Nord. It's the Lega Nord, because I don't know how to say it in English, actually I do, but it's not appropriate. You know, if there is somebody that has sputanato totally and for a century the whole idea of fiscal federalism, it's those guys. And in fact, Salvini, who's not dumb, he has a lot of other characteristics, but dumb is not. I said, forget it, that doesn't sell, let me actually do the opposite. Right? I don't know how long it will last, but marketing-wise, it's got him 30%. So forget about federalism. The Calergi, I have no idea about lots. You probably know better than me, and you'll tell me later. I invite you to get a cup of coffee. I think that helps. You know, the talk about Italian interest, it's all nonsense. It's just, it's a level at which I don't engage, other than laughing. You know, on Twitter, when they come with that, I do, you're an idiot, click, and that blocks the guy. So I don't have to waste time to have things like that. Why should we talk about that? The Medjugorje Virgin or something like that? It's the same intellectual level. And what can we do? I think that what we can do is I hope Lorenzo takes this well, is to have the courage to actually stop saying that some things are working. It's the, I mean, understand the metaphor, it's exactly like those that say, oh, but Mussolini did also good things. Yeah. It has the same logic. It's the same logic. Analytically, right now, in front of what we need to do, it's the same logic. Right now, what you need to do is to face a situation. The fact that the thing is not a collapse, it's just a decline, is because something works nevertheless, in spite of. So you better focus on the in spite of, not on the few things that give you hope. Because otherwise, if it had been a collapse and not a decline, we wouldn't be here debating. It would make no sense. And even the ottimismo della volontà, you know, the will, would make no sense. That would be completely crazy if there was not something still holding on. So yes, there is something still holding on, but let's move on and just focus on what's destroying it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Doing